So yes, let's dive in more in detail about those 3 steps that we mentioned. So access to information, risk assessment, risk mitigation, and finally we'll also have a few words on certification and due diligence, because it's quite a big topic. We won't have time to spend a lot of time on this big question, but we'll touch base on it. So let's start with the first step, access to information. We will first talk about what mandatory information you need to collect as an operator. And I want to start with a poll again. So I hope I will handle this as good as Tim is doing. Okay, so it's just to see if you have a basic idea about the information you are required, absolutely required to collect when doing due diligence. And I will keep the ball running for another 10-20 seconds. %. Let's keep 10 more seconds. Still coming in. Okay, I think we can now close the poll. Okay, so let me share the results with you. Yes, okay, so there were mixed answers. So species, I think everyone agrees almost. Forest of harvest, there's a little bit of hesitation. Same for botanical description of trees. Country of harvest, that's a definite thing. And then we have a few answers for with physical property. So let me walk you through. Are you still back to the slides? Yes, okay, good. So let's start with the information that should always be known and documented when you're an operator. So that's quite a big list, but let's look at the four first elements: description of the product, quantity of the product that you are buying and placing on the EU market, the identification of your direct supplier, so the tier 1 in the supply chain, and the identification of the buyers, unless you're selling to end customers. So those are elements that are usually not too difficult to gather, right? Because they are part of usual business practices. So that's not where the big challenge is, let's say. Then let's move on to species. Species is an information that should always be known, and scientific names might be required. We'll touch base on that a little bit later, but basically if there can be confusion with common names, then you will have to collect the scientific name as well. The origin should always be known also, so it's at minimum the country of harvest of the timber, right? So the forest, in which country are the forests that provided for the timber resources. Region or concession of origin might be required, but not always. Okay, so species and origin are slightly more challenging than business information, such as description of the product and quantity. And then we're coming to the last element, which is documents or information indicating legal compliance. Now, this will change on a case-by-case basis, and that's like the bulk of the challenge, because the EUTR is not listing all the documents and information you need on a case-by-case basis. So it will really depend on the supply chains you have on your hands. Now, why is that? Well, because the applicable legislation is not the same depending on the country of harvest, right? So depending on which country the timber is coming from, the legislation is not the same for a start. And also the degree of enforcement of this legislation, so the risk that it is not properly enforced, is also not the same everywhere, right? So the extent of this additional information collection that is expected of you will depend both on the legislation in place and the level of risk existing in the country, right, or in the region. But normally laws are applicable at the country level, so we're very often talking about level of risk at country level. Okay, so that's quite an important information to pick up on and to determine when you're doing a due diligence process. It's important to keep in mind that the objective of document collection is to identify if and where there are risks of legal violation, to be able to mitigate risks that have been identified, and to, in the end, conclude low risk of legal violation. Right, so it is very tempting to consider that the more information you have, the better it is. But asking how much information and documentation is needed is kind of the wrong question. It's very important to keep in mind that document collection is not an end in itself, right? It's an important step, but it's there to lead you to other steps. So asking your suppliers for documents and information, it must serve the purpose of risk assessment and risk mitigation, right? It should not serve the purpose of having a pile of documents that you're never going to read or assess or understand or examine. Okay, so the correct question is more which information and documents are relevant. Right? What an information or a document tell you? What is the purpose of this document? And how does it evidence compliance with forest-related legislation in place? So those are the important questions for you to make this list of additional information and documents that will be requested for your supply chain. Now, supply chain mapping is kind of the entry point into this due diligence and risk assessment process. But first of all, the EUTR is asking you to determine the country of origin. So supply chain mapping is an important step into determining at least the country of harvest of the timber, right? It might also be necessary to go beyond that and to identify the region and forest of harvest. So supply chain mapping is a good starting point. And it's also important to have faith and trust in your supply chain. So this is why backing up declaration on supply chain with, for instance, sales and transport documents as evidence of commercial link is quite important. It might not be there to evidence a risk of illegality. It might be necessary to support your supply chain identification, right? And to support the fact that there is a commercial link between all the entities leading back to this country. And then you can focus on the risk of illegality in the country of harvest. But you need to have a certain level of trust into the fact that this is the country of harvest where your timber is coming from. So supply chain mapping, quite important and a good way to start your due diligence process. These are the information that can be captured during supply chain mapping exercise. So of course the names of the entities involved in the supply chain, but also which are like, it's an exercise that can help you identify the different components of your products. So you might have a complex product with different components. So you will have a complex supply chain map, right? The species, the industrial processes in place, where and how products are transformed, who is doing what along the supply chain, and also the physical routes that might be different to the financial routes. So you might have entities in the financial trail that do not take physical possession of the product, for instance. So all this information will help you know where your product comes from to be able to start doing risk assessment on illegality at the forest level. Right. Certification claims is also an information that you can plug on a supply chain map. And now this is a very simple supply chain map, let's say, and very clean. But in reality, if you have a complex product, it's more likely to look something like this, right? Very complex with a lot of branches. You can also draw supply chains by hand if it's easier. I very often do this before inputting it into your computer, so it can be a table or a diagram on a computer. Use also pen and paper. Basically anything that is, when you have a clear picture and idea about supply chains, you can use, right? We have an Excel template, we'll mention this a bit later. We have an Excel template that is free and open and that you can use and adjust to your own company. But basically, there's a lot of different possibility to start doing supply chain mapping. Now, it's also important to talk about not only which information you need to have, but also the quality of this information that is requested, right? So our key questions will be, what is the level of trust that you have in the information that you have gathered? And how much evidence would you like to have? Asking about the validity of the documentation you've been provided. And finally, asking about like relatedness of the information and corruption issues. So let's start with trustworthiness. So trustworthiness is something you want to have on your supply chain information, right? In some instances, it might be the case that you have an information sent to you by supplier by email, and you might find that it is enough, right? Because you have trust on this information. On the other hand, in some instances, it might be the case that you're given one document that is evidencing a piece of information, but you have a doubt on it, and you might request more documents to cross-check this information, or you might multiply the sources of verification on this one information, right? So it's really depending on the level of trust you can place on an information. You can request different documents, but also different sources of information. And I'll briefly mention timber testing. Usually it's considered as a mitigation action, but it is also, you can see it as a way of cross-checking information, either on species that are in your product or the country or regions of origin of the timber, right? So laboratory testing can be used to increase your level of trust in the information you have on species and countries of origin. There's different kinds of tests that you can run with laboratory depending on what you are trying to evidence. You can also multiply sources of information, right? It's nice to have documents from your supplier, but if your level of trust is not strong enough, you can cross-check this with consulting stakeholders, experts, consulting reports, public reports from public authorities, NGOs, experts. You can, you can also make direct observations. So any source of information can be used to increase your level of trust in the information you have on your supply chain. So that's the first important thing, to have trust on the information that you have on your hands. Now, it is also very important to verify the validity of the information that you are provided with, right? And there's a few tips to do that. So you might not always be able to be 100% sure that a document is valid, but you might keep in mind a few checks, like a few background checks, like the dates of the emission of the documents, verifying that signatures and stamps are there, verifying that the template of the document looks normal and looks familiar and usual. And sometimes you also have online databases on which you can cross-check the validity of documents. So you can input a reference number and the system will tell you that's the official document was this, and you can compare. It's not the case for every document, but just be aware that it is the case for some documents. For instance, in China, you can check VAT invoices against an official database. So that's just an example. Yes, so also very important to just keep an eye on the visual aspects of the documents that you're provided with. So here, I hope you see it quite well. It's it's quite obvious that some fields have been tampered with and some fields have been blanked out, and like new information has been written on top of olden original information. So this might be a less obvious example, but I'm curious to see if some of you will pick up on anything unusual about these documents. So I'll just, just let you look at this document for a few seconds and then just run another poll to see if you've seen anything strange on these documents, if you're able to pinpoint it. It's very less obvious, but okay, I'm gonna run the poll now. I hope you had enough time. %. It's coming in fast. %. Let's wait just a few more seconds and I think I can close the poll. So close and share. Yes, so most of you hopefully did see something weird, and there's quite a lot of people who are not sure. And indeed, you have to see it, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. So I'm going to show it to you now. Yes, so yeah, here it is. So if you look closely, you can see that the lines on which the numbers are written are not continuous, right? There's like kind of like a little step going up and down. And it really, like once you see it, you really see that there's been new numbers that have been put on top of original numbers. So it's quite important to keep an open mind about the visual aspects of the documents, and knowing that document fraud is happening, can happen, right? You might not be able to detect it 100% of the time, but it's important to keep an eye on it, and keep an eye on anything unusual in the visual aspect of documents, right? Especially on numbers, legal entities written on documents, dates, quantity of material allowed for harvest or transport. Then we have this question of relatedness. The idea, again, is not to do a complete verification on volumes, for instance. It's just to keep an eye on the overall picture and the fact that all the information across your document package, it should make sense. It should be coherent, right? So you can keep an eye on big, like major discrepancies in dates or volumes, trading entities, dimension, quality, species, etc. Things should tally across and should make sense overall, right? Anything that is, if you have a forest owner that is selling just a few dozen of cubic meters, and in the end you are buying products for thousands of cubic meters, then there's a problem in terms of volumes, right? There's a really big discrepancies. So without doing full volume verification, you can ask yourself if information overall makes sense. And finally, corruption is key challenge. It's not something, again, that you will completely handle, but it's just a factor that will play a role in the level of trust and the amount of verification and information you want to gather, right? In some countries, you can get stamps and signatures on official documents without really complying with legislation. And corruption is itself an illegal act that is attached to the timber. So it's important to keep an eye on this and maybe raise the level of documents you will ask, and consider this as quite an important risk factor. Yes, so that's for the first part of accessing information. Now remember that in order to, it's not so much as a linear process as we would like it to be, but so maybe you would need to go to the risk assessment phase before being fully confident about the list and the identification of documents that you want to request to your supplier. Right? So let's describe the risk assessment process first. So the objective of the risk assessment phase is to assess the information that has been obtained, to identify the systemic risk of illegality in the country of harvest. So again, we have 5 categories of relevant legislation, and to assess whether there's a systemic risk applicable to your supply chain, right? So if there's a risk at the country level, is it applicable to my supply chain? And that's a process that can be called risk specification. So it's zooming in, zooming in from the higher level to the more detailed level of your own supply chain. And the idea is also to have enough detail if there is a risk to proceed with the last step, which is risk mitigation. And during this process, you will also ask yourself whether there's a risk that unknown material is entering your supply chain. So to make this process a little bit easier, we can break down, and the EUTR does this, it breaks down in different broader categories where we can zoom in one by one. So we can focus on origin, we can focus on species, trade and transport, and finally supply chain complexity is what we call risk of mixing. Right, it's similar, so it's a little bit apart. Once you've done all this process, you need to ask yourself if your supply chain is complex. Is there a risk of mixing with unidentified material? So let's break it down. So if we consider origin, species, trade and transport, the idea is first to identify whether you have conclusive risk factors in your supply chain. So that means a situation where really you can't do much about it. You should not place this timber on the EU market at all. Those conclusive risk factors are mainly linked to origin. So any timber which is under UN or EU sanctions. So it means this country has a UN EU sanctions related to timber, then should not be imported. Any armed conflict in the country of origin that is likely to fuel, like for which the timber trade is likely to fuel the conflict, is also completely prohibited. And of course, this is a bit more obvious, but any timber which is under a harvest or a trade ban should not be placed on the EU market. So those are conclusive risk factors, which is just no-go based on the origin. Then you have 2 green lanes based on origin and species, which are cases where your material is exempted from due diligence. So such as products which custom codes are not included in annex. There's 2 cases for which you don't have to conduct further due diligence on timber products. And those 2 cases are origin, so if you have a valid FLEGT license, and species if you have a valid CITES license. I will come to that in the next slides, just detail a little bit. So the idea is like, okay, is there a green lane or red lane first? In all the other cases, then you will need to ask yourself, what is the legislation in place? And what is the likelihood that this legislation is not properly enforced, right? And to help you do this, you might focus first on eye-catcher situation, let's say, which would be big red flags telling you to raise your level of attention, right? It does not mean that a high-profile case, so a case where illegal harvesting is quite systematic, it does not mean that you will never be able to import it in the EU. It just means that it needs to raise your level of care and attention on these products. So again, there's a few examples that I will detail in the next slides. So yeah, just this process of identifying higher level green lanes or no-go situations, and then dive into is there any high-profile cases that is popping up, and if not, okay, now I need to look at the legislation in place and the likelihood that it's not enforced. I have a little poll for you again. So species. Let's run this ball quickly. Do you think it is mandatory to have the complete scientific names of a species under the EUTR? We have 65% of voters. Let's wait just a few more seconds. %. Okay, I think we can close the poll now. Share. So 68% of you consider that it is completely mandatory to have the complete scientific name of species under the EUTR. Let's dive into this. So in practice, it is not absolutely mandatory. It is mandatory only when there can be confusion with the common name, which is true that it isn't in like most of the cases. Like it's very common. Well, we have this Quercus example. It's quite obvious that oak species are plentiful, and that is, if you're just saying you're importing oak, it does not give you a level of detail that is enough, right? So first of all, it is true that in most cases there can be confusion with the common name of the species. So it would make it requested to have the scientific name. Furthermore, the scientific name is also quite important to find out information on your species. For instance, checking its CITES status. You cannot check a CITES status without a scientific name, so quite important. IUCN searches also run on scientific name, and it's important to verify the coherence of information in relation to the declared origin of timber. So again, if you're just if your supplier is just telling you I'm working with oak, well, oak is growing in a lot of parts of the world, right? So you will not be able to cross-check. Does the species grow in the country of harvest? Does it make sense? So yes, so in most cases, it is always better to request the scientific name of the species. Okay, I hope this is clear. Yeah. Now we have a few species which are high profile. We should again just raise a red flag and say, oh, you need to be more careful with the species, because there's a lot of like the cases of illegal logging of the species are plentiful and have been quite seriously documented over and over. So we have Ipe from Brazil, Kivezingo from Gabon, rosewood from Madagascar, Mongolian oak from East Russia. I think, yeah, I have a few pictures here. Again, it does not mean that you cannot import those species into the EU. It just means that the level of care and verification that you will need to implement is gonna go up. It's a risk factor. Now, just a few words on IUCN Red List. The IUCN is just an indication of the conservation status, right, of biological species. So basically, it's a scientific evaluation of the conservation status of a species. So it's not because species is at high risk, it's endangered, that it cannot be harvested or traded legally. It's quite different. So you have several degrees of biological status that you can look it up. Again, it's a risk factor, right? So an endangered species could be harvested and traded legally in a country. It could be endangered in the wild, but not endangered in a plantation setting, right? So it's just, again, a piece of information that you can take into account to determine whether you want to raise the level of verification that you're going to implement, because an endangered species is more likely also to be protected in the country of harvest. So that might be something that you want to dig in, and that you should dig in and look more closely, right? So do not get confused that IUCN status does not mean illegality, but it could, or it's a risk factor. Trade and transport. So trade and transport verification, so higher level verification. It's quite well known that misclassification on trade and transport documents can be a way to avoid paying taxes or to conceal illegal harvesting, right? So not declaring the right species, not declaring the right volumes on trade and transport documents is quite a well-documented way of avoiding legal requirements. So that's also why it's quite important to pay attention to differences in those descriptions on trade and transport documents that you are receiving. And the other red flag that can pop up about trade and transport illegalities is transfer pricing. So this does not show up very frequently, but basically it's about paying attention whether there is any tax haven in your supply chains that could indicate tax avoidance, basically, in the country of harvest, right? So transfer pricing is the practice of artificially lowering the prices at the export point outside the country of harvest. So the profit made in the country of harvest are very low, so the taxes also get low, and high profit is made in an overseas country with a beneficial tax regime. So it's a bit of a complex situation, but it's important to keep an eye on the presence of any tax haven in your supply chain. Now, origin. Yeah, let's just start with the green lane. So FLEGT licenses. Product covered by FLEGT licenses are exempt from EUTR, so exempt from due diligence. Currently, Indonesia is the only country which is delivering FLEGT licenses, right? So there are other countries which are engaged in a FLEGT negotiation process with the EU, but only Indonesia has reached the final step where they can deliver licenses. And basically what it means is that there's a bilateral agreement with the EU where we consider that verification and legality is strong enough in Indonesia. And it's done ahead of arriving in the EU market, right? It does not mean that you should not check that the FLEGT license you're provided is valid and applicable, right? So there's still a little bit of checks to be conducted, but if you have trust that the FLEGT license is applicable, is linked to your material, then you don't have to include this material within your due diligence system. You might want to do it, but you're not required to. Again, such a species, there's high-profile cases, so countries or region with quite well-documented cases of illegalities. Again, just raising your level of attention. So with just like a few examples of reports, Amazon's, Congo, but also I think Ukraine, and the first one, Myanmar. Yeah. So just again, if you're importing timber from those countries which are under the radar, let's say, it means you need to raise your level of verifications. But then, so if you have excluded all these cases of green lane or red flags, in any case, you will need to further evaluate the risk of illegality in a given country. So I'm going to show you this picture just to again highlight what it means to do a risk-based assessment. So in any conformance assessment, regular conformance assessment, the process would be to ask yourself for each entity along the supply chains, what are the rules that they are supposed to enforce, and let's check that they are enforced. So you're going to list all the rules and check all the rules. In a risk-based assessment, the process is a bit different. You need to identify all the rules first, but then you can ask yourself, how well are they generally enforced? Right? What is the likelihood of non-compliance with those rules? And you will focus your attention only on the rules that are likely to be breached. And the other one, the ones that are not generally non-compliant with, you can consider that there's a low risk of non-compliance, and you can basically ignore them or not conduct further verification on those rules. So yeah, just keep in mind that this is the risk-based assessment process. And since legality is most often defined at the country level, the idea is to ask yourself if there's a specific risk of illegality at the country level, in the country of harvest. If yes, is this relevant to your supply chain? And if yes, is it already mitigated by something, or do you need to do something more to mitigate the risk? Let me walk you through a fictive example that I hope is going to bring some light on this thought process behind risk assessment. So let's say I am an importer into EU, and I'm importing timber from plantations, right? I know that my timber is coming from country X, and I have verified all this, so I'm confident. It's coming from this country, it's coming from plantations. I have identified 3 rules that are not very well enforced in this country. 3 pieces of legislation that are not usually well enforced. The first one is the risk that timber is overharvested in natural forests, right? So forest operators are exceeding quotas. Well, I am importing timber from a plantation, and I'm confident on that. So it's not applicable to my supply chain. So I can rule out this risk of illegality in my supply chain. The second risk is the risk that harvesting is conducted without the annual harvest permit being delivered by forest authorities. But if I look in my document package that my supplier has sent me, I can see that there is this annual harvest permit there. So it's already been sent to me. So if you want, this risk has already mitigated itself without me doing any further action. So I can know that this risk is here, but it's okay, because I know that the documents that is missing, that can be missing in some cases, is not missing. I have it on my hands. And finally, there's this risk that mandatory social agreements with local communities are not signed prior to harvesting. And in this case, this risk is applicable. And I do not have any documents mentioning a social agreement with local communities. So this is the rule, this is the risk that I will focus my attention on, and that I need to highlight and address or mitigate, right? So this is kind of the thought process that that is constitutive of risk assessment. Finally, on this second step, supply chain complexity issues. So the idea behind supply chain complexity is to detect the risk that materials could be mixed with unknown material and/or illegally harvested or traded material. The idea is that any unknown material could be illegally harvested or traded, right? And this assessment needs to be conducted across the whole supply chain. So not only in the country of harvest, but really across like any entity of the supply chain is a point of risk of mixing. So the guiding question here is, have I identified all the material entering the final product? And whether a different input would carry a different level of risk, right? That's also the second step that's quite important. Let's go for another poll. And launch. So yes, to evaluate the risk of mixing, should we take into account only the forest, only the sawmills, all tiers, all processing units, or only our direct suppliers? I have 40% of voters. Let's keep it running another 10 seconds. 65%, I think, I can wait just a little bit longer and close. Yeah, okay, let's share the results. So, so yes, all tiers in the supply chains are should be taken into account. So if you, even a trader that is not processing the material, but just handling the material, could be a point in the supply chain where mixing happens, right? So even if which would be trading sawn timber, so basic sawn timber, could mix sawn timber from different origin in its warehouse, even if it's not doing any processing, any transforming of the material, right? So that's something you need to consider into account. That's why it's important to know who is doing what along the supply chains, because you need to know the processing practices in place at any point of the supply chain to evaluate whether contamination is possible or likely, right? And so not only your direct supplier, not only the sawmill, but yes, all the tiers in the supply chain need to be considered. It means you need to think about them. Doesn't mean it's that there's a risk at all the levels, but they need to be taken into account in your assessment. So this evaluate risk of mixing is quite challenging and quite complex. There's not a single way to do it, but there's a few factors that you can take into account and that are highlighted by the EUTR. So those are, for instance, the length of your supply chain. So the more tiers in your supply chains, the more risk of mixing will be high. The route of your supply chains too, so the more different countries are involved and export processes are involved, also quite a good indication that the risk of mixing is going to be stronger. The complexity of your product, of course, if you're dealing with solid sawn timber, it's much more easy to keep traceability of this than having a very multi-components product with composite material, right? That might include a lot of species from a lot of countries of origin. So this is a factor that you also need to take into account. Any segregation of traceability systems in place at any point of the supply chains should also be taken into account. And this is why certification can play a role in mitigating this risk. We'll come to that. Volumes mismatch can also be an indication that you might not have identified all the sources of your timber. Right, this just visual examples of the importance of identifying all components of a product. It's very common that on MDF products, the veneer layer is completely thrown out of the due diligence system because it seems to be such a small part, and it's quite often not identified as a product as such, but it usually has very different species and very different countries of origin, and it has its own supply chain, right? So that's something you need to pay attention. Even those normally are included. So you need to pick your products apart and ask yourself what the different components, and also on the right-hand side, you can see a real-life example for composite product where 90% of the product was made from rubber wood, which is quite a low-risk species, but there was still 10% coming from tropical hardwood, which was virgin material, not recycled, and which should be assessed as such, and probably has a different country of origin than the rubber wood. Yes, and knowing about the segregation systems in place within suppliers is obviously quite also important into weighing the risk level of contamination of the material. Right, so that's for the second, let's say, the risk assessment step. Now let's move on to risk mitigation. So what happens if you have identified, as we saw in the fictive example, you've identified a risk, you need to do something about it. It's important to mention that the more you understand and specify the risk, the more appropriate the mitigation action will be, and the more easy it will be for you to find out the right mitigation action. Now, each risk that you have identified must be individually addressed. Right? All the risks should be addressed. Risk mitigation, again, can be incremental and happen in several steps. So in some cases, you will need more information first, and that's in itself a risk mitigation action. And then you might go on site at the factory, and then you might think about going on the forest because you don't have enough information. So it can be incremental and happen in several steps. There is no strict list of actions available. So the EUTR is not telling you, in this case, do this, in this case, do that. So it's up to you to find out, based on the case-by-case basis, based on the risk, what is the best option. Knowing that operators must verify and justify the effectiveness of the actions that they undertake, right? And that is why cooperating with suppliers is really important into having good and efficient risk mitigation action. So let's talk about different options of risk mitigation action. So the main ones, obviously. Let me ask you again something. And that's the last poll for this presentation. So which action do you think can be appropriate as a risk mitigation action within a due diligence process? At 30% of voters, 50%, let's keep it running just a little bit more. %, okay, a few more seconds. Okay, I think I can close the poll now and share. So what I can see is that a big part of you have chosen all of the solutions, and indeed all of them can be relevant and appropriate, right? So timber testing, okay, let's go to the slides. Yes, so really have a huge option of it, a huge number of options, a huge number of options available here. We can divide those options into two big groups, but that's just a way of presenting things. So we have risk avoidance actions, which would be more about replacing or changing something about the material or the supply chain. But we also have controlling the risk. And this is more about really digging deeper into whether a risk of illegality is happening or not in the supply chain. So I will present a few examples. So collecting additional information is almost something that happens all the time, right? It's a 90% case that you're given an initial document package or information, and you are missing a piece of information in order to determine whether there's a risk or whether this risk is applicable to your supply chains. Very often it's not obvious. The country of harvest, for instance, is not obvious based on the initial document package, in which case you need to collect more information because this is a mandatory information, right? So collecting additional information, very common. It can be done. First, it's quite important to notice that in some instances, the risk itself is the absence of a legal document. So collecting this legal document, such as a harvest permit, as I was mentioning, is the obvious and most efficient risk mitigation action in these specific cases, right? Where the absence of document is the risk in itself, and collect the document is the easiest and most efficient action. But it can also be about double checking information. As I mentioned, you have access information, you have conducted some risk assessment, you're in a country with a high level of risk, you might want to collect more documents to double check the information that you're given, right? Tibber testing in this instance is an option that's quite good to verify origin and all species. Replacing supply chains is another viable example. So sometimes you may want to replace the species that you're using. You may want to replace one of the supplier in the supply chain. So it might just be forest. It doesn't have to be the whole supply chain. You might just request your sub-supplier to source from a different forest. You might also request your supplier to source from a different origin. So you might want to keep working with your factory, but request them to import timber from a different country. And you might also request a different certification status of the material in place. So that's about changing something in your supply chain. And that's just an example of a case where, let's say, there's a risk at the country level that forest management units that are close to protected area go inside the protected area and harvest timber in the protected area, right? So it's been documented, it's happening quite a lot, so there's a risk here. There's a known case of illegal logging. Well, you might keep your supply chain as it is, but you might request the sawmill, which is here, to just stop sourcing from this FMU that is too close to the protected area, or stop selling you timber that is coming from this FMU that is too close to the protected area, right? So that would be a viable example. Of course, you need to justify that it is efficient and that it is indeed happening, and that the material coming from this forest management unit is indeed not entering your supply chain anymore. So you've controlled the risk here. Changing procedures can also be an option. So very often supplier might be able to share the burden of risk mitigation. So for instance, you might request them to implement more strict segregation and traceability procedures, but you can also request them to anticipate the demand for information and documentation from their own supplier. And it might also help you initiating the risk assessment process, right? Yeah, so might agree to conduct extra checks before selling products. So again, collaborating with suppliers based on the risk that is here is quite a good option. And it's important to keep in mind also that suppliers closer to the area of risk, they might speak the language of the country, and they will likely have local knowledge of what is happening. Now, auditing supplier is also something that can be quite useful. I know it can be quite costly too, but there's also a lot of opportunities, I think, to visit supplier in a more business or marketing perspective, where you can merge concerns of like legality verification to business trips to your suppliers. Auditing suppliers can be done, so it can be done as part of the risk mitigation process. So just to verify whether a risk is applicable to your supply chain or not. It can also be used after implementing a risk mitigation action to verify that it is effective, right? So if you request a supplier to implement stronger segregation procedures, then you might want to visit the supplier at some point in time to verify that this is implemented efficiently. So auditing can happen either at any processing entity along the supply chain or at the forest level, and it can include different types of activities. So you can review documents with your supplier. It might be easier to just sit in the office and go through documents rather than asking them to scan documents over documents over documents. Field visits in the forest setting can be quite important, but it can also be realizing interviews with the workers, with the staff, with anyone involved, and or consulting stakeholders and experts. So auditing is an option. Replacing suppliers altogether, also a viable option. that sometimes it's not always possible to initiate change within your supply chain. So you might have to replace one or several suppliers, if not the whole supply chain. That might be the easiest way for you. Yeah, so those are a few examples of risk mitigation options, and I will walk you through a quick case study of a real-life example, just to illustrate how this process can happen. So it's a case of a company importing oak, and the supplier was declaring that this oak was from Jilin province in China, right? So both the species and the origin were a high-risk situation, right? Like eye-catcher situation. That's something that has a high-risk profile. So what the company did, so the initial risk mitigation that they did was timber testing, right? So cross-checking species and origin information, because the level of trust was really not strong enough. So they sent the product to a lab, and the results showed that the most likely origin was more the Russian Far East than China. Okay, so here they have come upon a case where the origin that they've identified was probably not the right origin. And it was from a different country, so different country, different legislation in place. So after this initial risk mitigation, what they did was really get into close collaboration with the factory in China. So they kept working with their factory in China, with their supplier, but they did implement training of the staff. They also implemented strongest chain of custody systems within this factory. And they also asked them to implement the document checking procedures before sending material to them. And they also changed their source of timber to US oak. So basically, they worked very closely with their supplier to source from a different country and to implement stronger traceability procedures, document checking, and they also trained their staff. And finally, they also decided to have regular retesting of this material to ensure that the origin was the US, right? So that really shows you how it can be. It's not always the case that it is so complicated and with different steps, but it can be the case that you need to do several steps of risk mitigation in order to reach a low risk conclusion and be able to import the timber within the EU. Yes, so that's almost the end of this step. Very important, risk mitigation action should always be recorded. So you must be able to justify what you have done and what was the efficiency of the action you've conducted, right? So again, we have this kind of circular process. You need to keep track of all the steps you've implemented, and you need to be able to, in 1 year time, 2 years time, you need to be able to very quickly open your whatever record you have, paper, IT, and be able to say, oh, I've done this, this, and this, and so the conclusion was low risk. And this only after all this process did I import the timber into the EU, right? And you need to keep going in circles until you've reached a low risk conclusion. So that's it for our 3 steps of due diligence. Now, yeah, let's have a few words on certification and due diligence. So, certified material is not a green lane under the EUTR. What it means is that certified material must be included within your due diligence system, right? It is not exempt, such as exempted products can be, or FLEGT licenses can be. It must be included in your due diligence system. However, it does not mean that it's useless and that it does not help you reach a low risk conclusion. It does help you decrease the level of risk of illegality for a product, and it does help you decreasing the amount of verification and assessment you will conduct, right? So the EUTR is listing a few specific requirements for credible certification systems, and it does give a little bit of guidance on how to properly include certified material within the due diligence system. So first of all, the idea is that there's a lot of certification schemes for timber that are out there, each of them with their own specificity. So the main ones are PFC and FSC, which are aimed at certifying sustainable forest management that includes legality and implementing chain of custody from forest to the consumer. You can also look at others which are more focused on legal forest management, start and chain of custody, so that's the case of OLB. You can have also other schemes such as Legal Source, which is our preferred by nature scheme, which is a certification of due diligence processes in place, and it also includes legality, and it can also certify legal forest management, and also with a chain of custody process in place. And then you have also others that are out there. The idea is that certification schemes are private initiatives that each and every one of us can launch, and they're a voluntary mechanism for entities. So companies are not required and not obligated to subscribe to any of these schemes. So the idea of the EUTR is to say, I'm not going to endorse any of those, right? Because there's too many and it's a private initiative. So the EUTR is not endorsing specifically any of those, saying, oh, this is fine, it's a green name. What it is saying you can use certification as a way of reaching low risk of illegality, but you need to be sure first that the certification scheme is covering the same thing that the EUTR is covering, right? So the legislation that is taken into account by the certification scheme must be identical to the legislation that is defined by the EUTR as relevant. So if you remember, that's our 5 categories of legality. So very important to understand, if you're using a certification scheme, which area of legality it covers. And secondly, it's also important to assess how this certification scheme is working. So basically, if it's delivering its promises and if it has systems in place that is upholding its strengths and credibility. So for instance, it's chain of custody systems to ensure that the material from certified forest is not mixed with other material throughout the supply chains. It's about controlling false claims. It's about the auditing process. So it's important to have trust in the way that the certification system is functioning, right? So this is an assessment that must be done by operators using certification schemes. Now, there is already 2 evaluations of FSC and PFC against EUTR that we have developed, and there is going to be more to come. There's a study ordered by the European Commission that is going to come out in the next weeks, hopefully. So you should do this evaluation yourself unless you find a credible evaluation out there done by a third party that is saying, okay, the EUTR says this, and this certification system is covering this and is working this way, and that's why we can use it as a factor of low risk, right? So if a scheme is assessed as appropriate, you can use it. But remember that you always need to collect information on the countries of origin and all the species. So this requirement does not go away even if you're buying certified material. Right, that's the first thing. Then the second thing is you also need to take into account the level of corruption of governance issues in the countries of harvest or in the countries in your supply chains. So even the best certification system might not be able to address systemic problems of corruption and governance issues. So you need to also keep this factor in mind just to determine whether you want to increase your level of verification. And finally, you also need to make sure that the material you are buying is actually certified. So is the certification claim valid? Keep in mind that a certificate holder, so an entity having a FSC or PFC certificate, for instance, can also sell you non-certified timber. Right? So like a factory which is certified can have 2 lines of production, one for certified material. This material will be checked by auditors, and one for non-certified material. And this material will most likely not be checked by auditors. Right? So there's no process in place to increase the level of trust on the legality of this non-certified material. So it's important to check the validity of the certification both of the product and of the entity selling the certified timber. So yes, checking that the supplier certificate is valid is quite important. Important to use public databases when they are available, right? Because the way it works usually is that the certificate can be delivered for a period of, let's say, 5 years, but the auditor will come every year. And if, let's say, the 3rd year, they notice some major non-conformance, or maybe the entity is not interested anymore, then the certificate can be terminated. But the PDF version of, oh, you have the certificate, it's still out there, right? It still can be sent to you. So do check official databases, because a PDF version certificate does not really mean anything. It could have been terminated in the meantime. Whereas public databases are usually up to date and will give you information about the validity of the certificate to this date. Checking the scope of the supplier certificate is also important. So this material that you're buying, are the species and the product in scope of this certificate? And verifying that the product is certified is often possible with verifying relevant sales and transport documents that normally must include relevant certification claims. That's how you could say that a product is linked to a certified system and to a certified forest, right? Yes, so checking sales and transport document is quite important. And that's just a few examples about the FSC public database, where you can quite easily do search on certificates, inputting either the certificate code or the name of the company you are checking.